More and more teachers have been assaulted as a result of the SNP's education policy. Here's a report from the Herald. This week, you see these quite routinely through the year. School safety fears as proportion of pupil exclusions for violence rises. The Education Secretary is facing calls for more support to tackle distressed and problematic pupil behaviour after figures showed the percentage of exclusions due to physical assault, fighting and threats of violence is rising. Exclusion means temporary exclusion, so suspensions as they used to be called. So they call it distressed pupil behaviour. So if pupil punches teacher, that's because they're suffering from distress. It's not their fault, it's just a symptom of the distress they're experiencing. Problematic. Boy punching teacher isn't problematic, it's outrageous behaviour. Anyway, let's see. Growing pressure on Shirley Ann Somerville also comes amid union warnings of a post-lockdown increase of incidents of aggression, particularly among P1 and 2 children. So the youngest children at primary school, increasingly aggressive. A policy of using exclusions only in the most serious circumstances and the rollout of dedicated in-school support and nurture units have helped slash the overall totals across Scotland in recent years. Now let's just be clear here. Which totals have they slashed? The total number of assaults on teachers? Assaults on other pupils? No. They've slashed the number of pupils who get excluded temporarily or permanently from school. So the number of pupils who are punished. The number of pupils who are behaving outrageously and assaulting teachers, that's increasing dramatically, but they've slashed the number who've been punished by it, for it. And that's their idea of success. Again, notice the response. They need more support and nurture. So when some 15-year-old boy decides he's not going to be told what to do by his female art teacher and decides to thump a one instead, what he needs is more support and more nurture. In other words, the more violent you are to the teachers, the more you're treated as a special case, the more is provided for you, the more they say to you, how can we help you? Is there anything more we can do for you? What would you like us to do? What would you like to change about the school? That's the response to, for example, pupil violence against teachers. Right, figures for the state sector show that in 2020-21, just one learner, why can't they just call them children? Anyway, one learner was removed from the register, which is when an excluded individual does not return to their original school and is instead taught elsewhere. This is down from 3 in 2018-19 and 60 in 2010-2011. So last year, one pupil in the whole of Scotland was what used to be called expelled from school. Only one. Now, when I was teaching in an independent boys' boarding school, I would say on average, at least 1 or 2 boys would be expelled every year. They would break major rules persistently, or they'd break a very major rule just once, and that would be it. They would be gone. And that was really important for maintaining discipline within the school. But in the whole of Scotland, only one pupil was actually expelled from school. So all these cases where a pupil has assaulted a teacher, so a pupil goes up to a teacher, smashes a one in the face, and then that pupil stays in that school. And all the other pupils see that pupil is still in the school. That teacher has to see that pupil in the school in their daily life from then on. When that sort of thing happens, that pupil, let's say pupil thumps teacher in the face, that pupil should just never be seen again in that school. The rest of the pupils should say, oh, remember what happened to him? Yeah, he's not here anymore. Because that is just beyond the pale. And that pupil themselves should realise that if you behave like that in a context, then really you're finished in that context. You're out. You're going to have to go somewhere different. It really is that serious. But instead the message is, sort of, hey ho, these things happen. We can all just carry on and live with it. And then when you have that atmosphere, that ethos, then it happens more and more frequently, which is exactly what is happening. Anyway, a little over 51% of known exclusions in 2020-21, 4,300 cases were due to fighting, physical assault using a weapon or improvised weapon, or the threat of physical violence with or without a weapon. Union bosses have said the problem will require a targeted response. They also highlighted a recent EIS, that's the Educational Institute of Scotland, which I think is the most extreme left-wing teaching union that basically spends its time wanting teachers to do less work for more money, while simultaneously agreeing with the government on every single policy that they put forward in terms of educational philosophy. Anyway, EIS members in Aberdeen found nearly half were considering quitting after suffering high levels of physical and verbal abuse. Nearly half of teachers considering quitting because of high levels of physical and verbal abuse. That sounds like crisis to me. That is a crisis. Not a problem that needs targeting. That is a universal crisis. Right. Statistics for 2020-21 show that 1,153 cases of exclusion, which means temporary exclusion, suspension, were as a result of a physical assault or threats of violence specifically against staff. Over 1,000 cases of violence or threats of violence against teachers. Outrageous. Unbelievable. Right, EIS leaders said last night that incidents of pupil violence were increasing. They revealed one member in the primary sector suffered a broken jaw and damage to an eye socket after being kicked in the face by a pupil. Another individual in a different school was punched by a P2 child and had a tooth knocked out. Now let's bear in mind, only one child in the whole of Scotland was expelled from school last year. And so one of those two, either the face kicker or the tooth knocker out, at the very least one of those two children is still in that school, very possibly in the same class as the teacher that they attacked. Right, Larry Flanagan, EIS General Secretary, said, members are reporting increased levels of distressed behaviour from pupils. Notice again, distressed behaviour, not distressing. So he's saying that the reason the pupils are behaving badly, the reason they're attacking teachers is because they're stressed or they're distressed, they're upset, okay, they're feeling a bit emotional at the moment or whatever. It's not their fault, it's not wrong, it's just that it's a symptom of their emotional state. Anyway, some quite young were seen to be rooted in their experience of the pandemic and which can be highly disruptive to teaching and learning. Now, in our council election leaflets, we've got a line of what do pupils need in schools, and one of the things we say they don't need is teachers who make excuses for bad behaviour. But here we are. So pupil punches teacher in the face or kicks her in the face, whatever, but then, that's because of the pandemic. It's because they're experiencing the pandemic. That's what's led to it. That's the real cause. They're not responsible for their actions. It's just been caused by the pandemic. That's what it all comes from. So it's not really their fault. Right, he continues. There is an urgent need to increase the specialised staffing necessary to support pupils with additional needs around behaviour. In other words, who behave really, really badly, including attacking teachers. In order that they as individuals are assisted, but also to ensure that other pupils can continue with their learning. So these badly behaved pupils need to be assisted, not punished, not brought into line, not taught a lesson, assisted. That's always the line. Support and assistance. No punishment, no moral responsibility. They're sort of old-fashioned. They're from previous generations. We now assist them and support them. So how's it going, Larry? How's your philosophy going in Scottish schools? Because it's been in place for decades now. How's it going? How are the results? Well, you've been explaining yourself. Increased levels of violence towards teachers. Right. Aileen Pryor, Executive Director of Parents Organisation Connect, said, providing training, safe spaces and tailored support for young people is the way to go. Again, same idea. You've just got to give the pupils what they want and what they need, and then they'll behave themselves. No responsibility. For children and young people, behaviour is communication. Right, that's just nonsense, isn't it? I remember years ago when I was teaching, I had to go to a course about restorative approaches, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, which is founded on the idea if someone misbehaves, it's because they're upset about something, and they're trying to communicate the fact that they're upset or they've got a particular need. So behaviour is communication. I sat there in the training, I put my hand up and said, basically, no, it's not. I said, for example, they were saying all behaviour, everything you do is a form of communication. So I said, I brushed my teeth this morning. Was that a form of communication? And the person leading the session said, oh, yes, it is. It communicates that you want to keep your teeth clean. I mean, it's pathetic, isn't it? It's absolutely pathetic. But sadly, That is the standard of intellectual engagement that often underpins educational ideology in Scotland. Anyway, we can only surmise how these stresses are reflected in the statistics published here. So again, pupil kicks teacher in the face. They were trying to communicate that they were upset about something or they needed something. So what you have to do is try and find what they want and give them what they want, and then they won't kick teacher in the face anymore. That's the philosophy. Right, the Scottish Government spokeswoman said, "We advocate an approach for schools and local authorities to work with pupils on the underlying reasons behind inappropriate behaviour." Inappropriate. I really do not like that word. Wearing the wrong colour socks with your uniform is inappropriate. Going into the dining hall wearing shorts is inappropriate. Okay, kicking the teacher in the face is not inappropriate. That's not the right word for that. I mean, if you want better words, outrageous. How about evil? How about that? You wouldn't hear that word anywhere near anything to do with a pupil's behaviour. As far as they're concerned, pupils are basically sort of mini angels. And if they do something wrong, it's really someone else's fault or society's fault, or it's just something that's happened to them that's led them to behave that way, caused them to behave that way. Anyway, the government spokeswoman continues, "We have been clear with schools and local authorities that exclusion should be the last resort. Our guidance sets out that there are additional factors that need to be considered when a child or young person has a disability or an additional support need. So exclusion, which can be seen as a form of punishment, that should be the last resort. And in terms of permanent exclusion, it basically never happens now. But you need to think about the additional factors. Do they have a disability? Do they have an additional support need? Well, I'll tell you the answer. If a pupil goes and kicks a teacher in the face today, then yes, they've got an additional support need. Well, that's automatic. They've got a behaviour problem. That will be diagnosed as a behavioural problem, and they would need extra support, just by definition. The guidance places greater importance on preventative approaches, including good behaviour management. Now that sounds quite benign, doesn't it? Obviously, good behaviour management is a good thing for teachers. But what it actually means in this context is, for example, avoid confrontations. So if you know a little Charlie flares up and tries to attack you, if you insist that he actually does any work, then good behaviour management could include, just leave Charlie to it. Let him do a bit of colouring in, and don't actually put any pressure on him to make him do anything he doesn't want to do. And then you avoid the confrontation. You've been a good teacher, and Charlie's been able to stay in the class. Whereas the teacher who insists and says, no, you need to do some work. Look, everyone else is working. You've got to work as well. And Charlie flares up and there's a big incident. Well, that would maybe be seen as bad behaviour management. And that teacher would be told, could you not be like the other teachers? And just let him sit there and do nothing. Or just, have his own way. Don't try and make him do anything he doesn't want to do. That's often what's encapsulated in good behaviour management. Well, let's go over to the Education Scotland website and have a look at what the government's policy is in terms of discipline. Restorative approaches. Why use restorative approaches? Many people believe that children and young people who bully others must be punished for their behaviour. This type of response can be ineffective, dangerous, breed resentment, and make situations worse, as a child or young person can be resentful of punishment rather than reflective of their actions. So punishment doesn't work. Part of the reason is people resent it. In other words, people don't like it. Okay? If people liked punishment, the type of punishment that they like, that's what would be effective, you assume. Anyway, children and young people require the opportunity to hear about and face up to the harm and distress they have caused others. That's true, but that's not an argument against the necessity of punishment as well. Restorative approaches are built on values which separate the person from the behaviour. They promote accountability and seek to repair any harm caused in a situation. But the thing is, they don't promote accountability. They promote making excuses for and enabling people to give explanations and just wriggle out of situations without facing the just deserts. Right, exclusions from school can only be carried out when an incident meets the legislative criteria. In other words, you just be careful if you're thinking of excluding a pupil, because you've got to make sure you're following the law, so you just be careful. On the other hand, all schools have a responsibility to protect those being bullied, but also to educate all pupils, including those who bully or those with behavioural problems. Yeah, so implication there, you need to keep these children in school sort of pretty well regardless. You've just got to put up with them and manage it one way or another. So what are restorative approaches? Schools may use restorative approaches as part of a planned response to relationship and/or discipline difficulties. So we're not just talking about bullying, we're talking about discipline in general, discipline difficulties or bad behaviour, as it's better known. This is a more effective response than traditional punishments. They state as a fact, as though there's a body of research backing that up, which there isn't. But they just say as a fact, traditional punishments don't work. I assume they think this in the criminal justice system as well. If you look at the Scottish Government's direction of travel, they do actually think that. They think punishments don't work at any age, and they're in the process of progressively watering them down and phasing them out at every stage of life. Anyway, restorative approaches can change the emotional atmosphere in a school and lead to a more positive relationship between pupils and between pupils and staff. Right, well, I don't think the evidence is quite bearing that out, I think we can say. But they're not interested in the real evidence. They're not interested in what's actually going on in schools, about how many staff have been assaulted, etc. As far as they're concerned, it's leading to better relationships. Right, the restorative approach may include having a restorative conversation. These conversations may happen during the school day, and practitioners will use restorative language and questions to allow children and young people to understand the impact of their behaviours, okay, as though that's all that needs to happen. If they could just understand that when they kicked the teacher in the face, that hurt the teacher. If they could just be made to understand that, then they would never do it again, and the problem would be solved. As though they didn't realise before that kicking someone in the face actually hurts them. As though they were just a bit ignorant of that. If they could just be helped to understand that kicking people in the face actually hurts, once they understand that, it's all going to be fine. It's fantasy world. Right, more serious incidents may require practitioners to hold a formal meeting to involve parents and families where appropriate. Examples of questions used in a formal meeting. So let's imagine, the example I'm using from the newspaper report, teachers being kicked in the face by a pupil. So you sit down the pupil, say, what happened? What were your thoughts at the time? What have been your thoughts since? Who's been affected by what happened? Oh yeah, I think, it hurt the teacher. How have they been affected? Yeah, it broke the nose or whatever, knocked a tooth out. What do you think needs to happen now? I think I need to have some more time in the behaviour support hub. And when I get angry, I can go there and play on the PlayStation and have a hot chocolate instead. Then maybe I won't punch Mrs. So-and-so the next time round. So asking the attacker, asking the pupil who has committed the assault what they think needs to happen next. And not a hint. At the very beginning, they've ruled out any possibility of punishment, because as far as they're concerned, punishment is counterproductive. Just to say, in Scottish schools, we're not at the end point of this yet. They haven't actually completely eliminated punishment from all schools. But that's the way Education Scotland, driven by the government, is pushing. And I think in almost all schools this has had an influence, but in most schools it's had a huge influence, as I say, and as a result, discipline is falling to bits, and the statistics bear it out. But say they're not bothered about the facts. For them, ideology comes first, and the results come second. So no matter how bad the results, no matter how bad the statistics, they always think, well, the problem is that we haven't gone quite far enough in the direction we're going. The conclusion is never, we're going the wrong way, we need to turn around and go back again. The conclusion is always, we just need to go even further the way we're going. And that's the only way to resolve these problems. Now, in terms of these restorative approaches, when I was a housemaster years ago, I dealt with a lot of disciplinary issues. And I would sit for hours talking to boys about, why did you do that? What were you thinking? What about the other people? What effect it had on them? That's all fine. That's all perfectly valid. And that's good education to have those conversations. But it's also, in a lot of cases, important to draw the line where you say, right, that's what you've done. So as a result, this is the punishment that you're going to have, because that's what you deserve. We're not just going to put up with you doing this again and again. This is what's going to happen. There's a punishment for that. But as far as the Scottish Government is concerned, that option shouldn't be available for teachers. Now, this whole thing is founded on a humanistic philosophy, the idea that people are basically good. Children are basically good. And if they do something bad, it's not really their fault. just something's happened to them, something's gone wrong in their life story to that point, and that's resulted in them doing something wrong. If just we could perfect society, then people would be perfect. So people are not at fault. They're not responsible for what they do. And I just think that philosophy is simply wrong. I believe that people are morally responsible. And I know in my life, I can choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing in different situations. I know that. I have that choice freely. And I believe children, young people have that choice as well. And when they make the wrong choice, then punishment is deserved. Another thing on the horizon with this issue, of course, is children's rights, which are interpreted as meaning, in many cases, that you shouldn't punish children, even though there's nothing remotely like that in the rights, apart from that you can't have the death penalty for under 18s. But they're interpreted to mean you shouldn't really have any punishments at all in schools. What does punishment achieve? Why is punishment important? Well, one reason is that it's just fair. It's built into us as one of our most fundamental moral intuitions that wrongdoing deserves punishment. People who do something wrong shouldn't get away with it. If they get away with it, then that's a problem. That's an injustice. So I think that's really important, and that goes in schools as well. So when other pupils are looking on, they shouldn't see someone do something really outrageous and then they just see that there's been no punishment. The person themselves shouldn't be able to do something outrageous and then find that there's no punishment. That's not justice. That doesn't accord with our core moral intuitions. Another important factor is deterrence. Now, there's some pupils, you might find a hardcore who are going to be the tough nuts and they're going to misbehave persistently. But there'll be a lot of others who will watch them, see what happens to them, and then make their own decisions on that basis. So there's a large body of pupils where if the discipline in the school is pretty straight down the line, a bit tough, they might think, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to try it on with the teacher because I know it will happen. I don't want that to happen to me. So that's a really important part of maintaining discipline. But with this, they're not interested. There's no consideration of the effect on the rest of the pupils. What do the rest of the pupils see happening when a boy, kicks the teacher in the face? If they see that nothing seemed to happen, there wasn't really any punishment, then the other pupils will be emboldened to behave badly themselves. And it's also part of the education. You do something absolutely outrageous, you need to learn that the community is not going to tolerate that and that they're going to impose some negative consequence on you. Not just have a friendly chat about it, they're going to impose a punishment on you. Because that's the way adult society works, and children need to be inducted into that as part of their education. Now, I mentioned in passing there, the Education Scotland website mentioned some research into restorative practice. I looked at that research a few years ago. I made a video about it. I mean, the research is just an absolute joke. The quality of it is pitiful, and it doesn't actually show that it works either. In fact, it pretty well shows the opposite, actually. So that their claim for research of it is laughable. It's just got no foundation at all. Now, currently, Education Scotland and the Scottish Qualifications Authority are facing dramatic reform. Is that going to help? Is that going to make any difference? Well, no. It's a bit like me saying, when I go on my 10k run every week, I'm really slow, so I'm going to try a new brand of trainers. I think that'll fix it. I mean, with the Scottish educational establishment, putting a new label on it, calling them different things, is going to make no difference because there's no change in the philosophy driving it all. There's been a big review of Scottish education recently. Who carried it out? The bloke who used to be in charge of GTCS, of all things. So it's just a cosy club. They all think the same. So you can ask who you like within the blob, and you'll get the same answers, and it will keep going in the same direction. The Scottish Conservatives, you'll hear a Conservative MSP sometimes stand up in the Parliament and say they're outraged at the increases in assaults on teachers. But do they understand the whole philosophy of education? Can they see what's going wrong in it, the way I've outlined in this video? No, there's no indication that they understand that at all. Whereas the Scottish Family Party, we can see the problem, we can see the root of it in a flawed ideology, and therefore we can see how to put it right.